So I got a question from somebody, and their question was, Hi Mary, I would like to start a Qigong practice. However, I'm worried about Qigong sickness. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about that and what the difference is. Is Qigong sickness the same as Kundalini awakening? So it's a good question. And what I will do is I will talk a bit about definitions, what Qigong sickness or deviation is, what Zen sickness is, and then talk about how and if Kundalini awakening has anything to do with either of those. So I'm going to start with a bit of an anecdote. The year was, I think it was about 2005. I was involved in an Asian bodywork therapy certification. So this was a part of the school that I was going to, part of the Chinese medicine school. They also had a massage curriculum that I was doing, as well as an Asian body therapy bodywork program, which was basically coursework in Tuina, which is kind of a hardcore form of Chinese medical massage, Thai body work, which is it's more than this, but it's basically like assisted yoga. It's perhaps my favorite form of body work to receive, and shiatsu. And so I was taking a shiatsu course, and this course meant once a week for about 3 hours at night. And by this point, I had already, I have always been kind of a sensitive person, and I had already been going through a Kundalini awakening for a couple of years, although was not at the point where I, fully understood that fully, and I certainly wasn't at a point to share it with others. But nevertheless, that's kind of the background of what was going on here. And so I took this shiatsu course, and at the beginning of each course, the teacher had us do a Qigong exercise, a Qigong meditation. And I was not as familiar with Qigong as I am today. I learned a lot more about it in the program I was in, as well as, research and doing some retreats and all that sort of fun stuff. Um, but at the time, I suddenly started experiencing a lot of insomnia. And so I went to my acupuncturist at the time, and I was talking about my insomnia. We were kind of chatting about it. And then I started talking about how it was particularly bad after the shiatsu course. And when I told her what meditation the teacher had us doing at night, she became very upset. She was quite angry because, first of all, this was not a beginning meditation. And second of all, it was a powerful meditation. It was a meditation intended to raise energy. Put more simply, it is not something that should have been sort of cherry-picked and taught to beginning students. And it certainly wasn't something that should be taught before people are trying to go to sleep. And so even though I said that, I'm kind of a sensitive person and was going through this process, even people in the course who were kind of what I would call, normal constitutions, would remark, oh, I feel really, awake or weird after this course. Um, and so I share this partially as I'm going into thoughts about Qigong deviation because one of the main issues in Western society is that we have such a disbelief in spiritual reality. We are so removed from it that we tend to go for the most intensive meditations, try to do the most advanced things, basically have sort of a catharsis or sort of hit ourselves over the head with an anvil mentality in order to believe that something is true, in order for us to sort of convince ourselves of the reality of spirit, of the divine. I will tell another quick story that when I first started teaching spiritual bathing, I kind of separated out spiritual baths, which can have many different purposes, but I was specifically teaching it in terms of clearing energy purposes. I would teach that there were, mild baths and teach how to utilize them, more moderate baths, how to utilize them, and then baths that are essentially like an internal balm. They're intended for intense catharsis, intense sort of purging of the system. What happened was that people automatically assumed that they needed those intensive baths. And then they were wondering why they were tired afterwards, or, all this sort of stuff. And this is the same sort of phenomena, is that people don't believe we are so disconnected from spiritual reality. And the way that spiritual information comes across to us, we have such a deluge of information coming across to us that we really can go and sort of pick out an advanced practice without doing a beginning practice. And so this is one of the reasons, one of the main reasons that people experience Qigong sickness, psychosis, or as I will call it, Qigong deviation. So what happens when somebody has Qigong deviation? There can be some pretty intense symptoms. Some of the symptoms are intense headaches, psychosis, a feeling, significant digestive issues. But most of the symptoms of Qigong deviation are pretty severe, pretty intense. They can be things like shaking, paranoia, mania, and psychosis. If we are talking about how this originally appeared in the DSM-V, so kind of the psychology manual, it was originally put down as under a cultural affliction, so something that people basically in China rather than the West experienced because it was more understood there. And the way that it was understood there, or how it was diagnosed through the DSM-5, is through somebody who, it was basically an exclusionary criteria. And what that means is that somebody who had a somewhat normal or healthy background after doing Qigong would experience severe issues, severe symptoms, including psychosis, need to be hospitalized for paranoia, going into postures, shaking, things that were severe enough to create a complete breakdown of reality, a complete breakdown of functioning. So there are a couple of reasons why Qigong psychosis or Qigong deviation is looked at or somewhat well known. The first is that Qigong can be a fairly intense method of working and moving energy in the body. it has its softer aspects as well. But we also have to go into some of the political context of what was going on in China during the time. Qigong was outlawed from, I believe, the mid to late 60s to the late 70s. And during and before this time, so in the early to mid 60s, there was a lot of propaganda and a lot of fear that started to be inserted about Qigong practice. And some of this was right on, and some of this was sort of a political, spiritual sort of campaign against Qigong, with the thought that Qigong, all of the things that people in power are always afraid of, people experiencing awakening, people experiencing, thinking for themselves, breaking away from family, from society, that sort of thing. The other thing is that in Chinese medicine, often things are quite poetic and nonlinear. And so some of the descriptions of what some of the more intensive Qigong practices do include a lot of imagery of fire or dragons or even demons. And so it is interesting, somebody looking in or somebody sort of navigating this when they see Qigong and then they see a description of a fire demon, rightfully their mind might go to a bit of fear. And so, pretty similar to our culture, I always call there a lot of horror movies that I call propaganda because they're all like, dead-eyed nuns and like all these things that are meant to make us deeply afraid of the other. And I see a lot of these things as the same sort of propaganda. They are making us fear our own nature. They are making us fear our own power. They're making us fear connecting to spirit, connecting to ourselves without the need for an intermediary or somebody in power telling us who we are, what we can think, what we can do. So let's get back to the actual what is Qigong deviation? I will say that if somebody comes to me and they are looking for a practice to do, I generally would suggest people starting out with Tai Chi rather than Qigong. In Tai Chi, there is a beautiful flowing practice that achieves the result that a lot of people are looking for. They are looking for greater health and greater longevity. Maybe you've seen people do Tai Chi in a park or something like that. One of the benefits of some of the kind of forms of exercise or energy work that are like Qigong, Tai Chi, or yoga is that um, they are a routine. They have kind of a set practice that can be done. But also the big part is that they they can move energy through through the body. And so I will say any exercise will move energy through the body, but when we are doing something like walking or running, all what happens with our energy is that it is all in the same plane of movement. And so our energy tends to get jammed in and stuck into our joints. A really good example of this is running or walking. When we are running or walking, it is wonderful for our chi or energy movement overall, but energy will get kind of locked into our ankles, to our knees, compacted into our hips, and even into our spine as we are doing that exercise. if we're doing yoga or Tai Chi or Qigong, we are opening up the joints of the body so that energy can flow through them. And the joints are sort of areas of our body where two bones meet each other, or where there are sort of divots or crevices in our body, are areas where energy tends to get stuck and where we experience pain and discomfort and all that sort of stuff. So Qigong, if somebody is going about Qigong and they find a good instructor, or they even find a good resource online, what they are going to learn is 3 to 5 basic sort of methods of Qigong practices. And if somebody forms that kind of basis in Qigong, that Qigong foundational practice, the likelihood that they will become sick or psychotic or something like that is very, very low. Somebody does what's known as the healing sounds, for example, a Qigong healing sound for the liver, same thing. This is not an intensive practice. It is bringing gentle healing energy, gentle vibration, gentle to moderate, I should say, to that area of the body. It is important for Qigong to have preparatory or foundational practices in place, because I really love the phrase Qigong deviation for what can happen, the issues that arise when one of 3 things happens. The person goes to advanced practices without the foundation. They do practices too intensely, or they have a background in which they, um, a gentle word for it is neurotic, but somebody has already energetic, mental, emotional imbalances within their body. And what moving a bunch of energy around does is that it exacerbates those issues. For example, a lot of you may have heard or read about people who have gone to lengthy meditation retreats and then all sorts of difficulties arise for them later, even people who have needed to be hospitalized or, that sort of stuff. And a lot of times what has happened is that somebody is spiritually seeking because they are depressed, because they're stressed out, because they have a background where there is some form of latent psychosis, latent mental health issue. And what happens when the person faces themselves basically goes from a busy existence to sitting with themselves in silence for 7 days, or doing some of the body work that I did, where I'd go on retreats for a week or something like that, and it would be a lot of people working on you at once, and all this sort of stuff would come up very intensively within a short period of time. That is a lot for the system to handle and assimilate. And so what some people call Qigong psychosis are people who had previous issues with depression or some form of kind of what we may call a latent psychosis that becomes more active with the process, because they are likely doing one of the other things. They're likely practicing too intensely, doing the equivalent of dropping an anvil on themselves when a feather would be nice, or they are going into advanced work without a teacher, without that foundational material sort of in place. So when we are talking about Qigong diversion, a good way energetically of considering it is that in some of the more advanced methods of Qigong, it is strongly moving energy through the system. And so one of the ways that it strongly moves energy through the system is basically strongly moving energy through the midline or through the Du and Ren. So the energy sort of circling the midline, going through the perineum, flowing up the spine to the top of the head, and going back down the front to the perineum again. And so what you will notice if you look at what Qigong psychosis is, or what Qigong, um, you know, disorder is, a lot of it has to do with sending too much fire, too much force energy to the head. So things like having headaches, having eye issues, experiencing nausea, experiencing dizziness, that is a lot of energy going from below to above, basically being forced that way. And it specifically is a lot of fire energy, or what in Chinese medicine may be called impure energy. And so the thought with Chinese medicine is, if our digestive system, if our energy system is working well, what will happen in our stomach and digestive system is that dirty energy will flow downward after it is digested, down and out, and pure energy, or energy to sort of get us through our days, get us through our lives, to spiritually awaken us, will flow upwards. And so what can happen when people are forcing energy upwards through their practices, especially something as intensive as that Qigong sort of advanced practices can be, is that there can be a sending of impure energy, causing nausea, dizziness, all that sort of stuff, headaches, all that sort of stuff occurring, and just a lot of fire energy in the body as well, because some of these advanced practices are specifically stoking Kundalini energy in an attempt to get it to rise. And so what can happen to people in that situation when they are trying to force fire energy to flow through their body is that their sinuses and their lungs can kind of dry up, their eyes can dry out, again, headaches, thirst, a lot of kind of strange sort of stuff can happen. I will also share that with Qigong, there is a lot of, there can be energy that is forcibly moving up. And on a spiritual level, so much energy being forced up and going into the head can easily lead to somebody who has latent psychosis going into a psychotic break from reality, or even somebody who is just kind of what we might define as normal or mildly depressive. If somebody like that starts doing Qigong energy practices, Qigong practice that is forcibly shuttling energy around the body, and so much of it is going to the head, that things like paranoia, things like what we might define as psychosis, mania, just being completely untethered from reality, not being part of reality, feelings of, disassociation, but really intense mental heat symptoms. So those would be more of kind of like the paranoia, mania, psychosis sort of energies from too much fire energy going into the head. And so again, when does this happen to people? It happens to people who already have dysregulated systems, and they start doing this and it exacerbates what is already going on in their bodies. It especially happens to people who start doing something like find out an advanced practice, and they start doing it, and not only do they not do kind of the beginning practices, the foundational work to make the work safe, but they start doing the practices for like multiple hours a day. And so somebody who is kind of obsessed with practices like this and doing them for multiple hours a day will develop imbalances in their body, especially if they don't have that foundation first. So, what does Qigong sickness or Qigong deviation have to do with Kundalini awakening? Well, some of the more advanced meditations are particularly stoking of Kundalini fire. And so some people may be experiencing a Kundalini awakening as a result of Qigong practice. In that case, symptoms can be a bit different. They will be more in line with Kundalini awakening. And you can view my Kundalini awakening video for information about that. But um, there is a bit of convergence. Some individuals experiencing um, Qigong psychosis, Qigong sickness, deviation. Energy can not only be forced upwards, but it can flow pretty intensively through the channels. And what happens as a result of that is that people can do things like experience shaking, shivering, cold, go into spontaneous body postures or spontaneous Qigong positions. And is that a Kundalini awakening? Yes. Does that have more to do with in Chinese medicine? Does it have to do with Chinese Kundalini awakening? Would it be described in Chinese medicine a bit different? Yes. In Chinese medicine, and if we're going to other, countries and cultures, there isn't that strict linear translation of Kundalini in Chinese medicine. It is referred to in different ways. So somebody who is experiencing Qigong sickness may be referred to as having yin fire or wind in their channels, or phlegm in the head, something like that, lung dryness, things like that, that show an imbalance of fire in the body, creating wind. And if those two things are treated, then then things will settle down from them from that perspective. I do find that there is some crossover in terms of Kundalini awakening because Kundalini can be stoked for people. But a lot of times, what is happening with Qigong sickness and particularly Qigong psychosis is somebody that is doing practices too intensely, doing practices without a foundation, without a good teacher, and sending either a bunch of energy up their head or energy through the channels that is causing significant disruption in their life. And it doesn't have that much to do with Kundalini. So I would say of the people that I have worked with over the years who have experienced some form of Qigong psychosis, that first of all, I tend to hear from them kind of many years later, this is what happened. I was hospitalized at this point or went through a period of this several years ago, because somebody who is actively really sick in Qigong psychosis will have difficulty functioning. So they're, not in a place of booking an appointment, typically. But I would say 4 out of 5 people, and again, just doing kind of bad math, who visit me with some form of what I would term Qigong psychosis, um, are not experiencing a Kundalini awakening, a full Kundalini awakening. They may have stoked the fire of Kundalini, which results in Kundalini stirrings or Kundalini experiences. But that is a bit different than a full permanent Kundalini awakening, what we are talking about with Qigong psychosis, especially, but any kind of Qigong deviation is that energy is moving too rapidly, too much upwards, or too rapidly through the channels of the body. And the person needs to go back to basic practices, get a good Qigong teacher or a good practitioner that can help for them to calm their system down, to get them kind of off the ledge if they're doing too many hours of practice, and to help harmonize what is going on in their bodies. So let's now talk a bit about Zen sickness as well, and what that may or may not have to do with Kundalini awakening. There are two ways to look at Zen sickness. The first is that you can look at my chakra, especially the upper chakra videos for this, but what happens when we are awakening? So our chakras are coming online and flowing and releasing, and we are working towards self-realization or enlightenment. Is that eventually our crown and our Bindu point, our Bindu chakra, open? What happens at that point is that we encounter the voids. And the voids can be considered the basic ground of reality, or a sort of launching pad for reality. They are still in binary reality, so black, white, good, bad, but we're at sort of the primary primary source of all of those. The stark, dark, light, the stark self, non-self, whatever you want to call it. This is a tricky transition for people, because when we are in our bodies, when flow is going through our bodies and we're awakening, even in the upper chakras, there is still an awareness or an understanding that we are our bodies, that we are ourselves, we are our I. What happens when energy starts flowing out of the body after it's, transformed the whole system and started flowing outside of the body, is that we are at that launching pad of reality. We're at that foreground or ground of basic reality. And when people break through there, they experience things like union, an introductory conceptualization of the universe or things being false, or, experiences of disreality, as well as the first sort of awarenesses of non-self, basically who somebody is beyond their physical form. So people frequently get really stuck here. And that is because this is sort of the last hurrah of the ego. And what that means is that if they were to move any further, they would experience kind of the last ego death. And what happens in this state is that there is a pull to that, there is an awareness of that, but the ego and all the parts of self that are still kind of clinging to the physical body, to what they know to be true, to last beliefs or understandings of reality, are still sort of clinging on, not wanting to let go. If you look at my Bindu video, I chose an image of a black hole for a reason, because this experience is sort of like if you are in a spaceship on the edge of a black hole and it is trying to suck you into that nothingness. Are you going to go willingly, or are you going to go screaming into the abyss, so to speak? And so a lot of people experience what is known as the first definition of Zen sickness, because they are sort of in this liminal space. They have considerably awakened. They have gained stream entry, or whatever terms you want to put on it. They have experienced the no self. But what somebody may experience in this state is a great amount of fear or anxiety. They may also go into a state of disreality, so feeling removed from their life, removed from their bodies, like nothing matters, nothing is important. They may also still feel kind of last vestiges of beliefs or understandings about reality and be really sort of stuck in them. They may be stuck in ego and considering like, oh, like, look at me, I've had an enlightenment experience, and considering of the self as special or heightened due to that experience. And the ego knows us on some level. They know that, you know, but again, we can consider this like kind of another ego test, because if somebody is in this state and they're like, oh yeah, now I'm guru, now I'm arhat, now I'm ipsissimus, like now I am Jesus or Buddha or, any of those sort of things. Now I am enlightened. Those are still the ego clinging to the self. And so that can prevent somebody from kind of going into that black hole, because what's on that other side of that black hole is true union. It is everything, everywhere, all at once. I have watched that movie for people who've recommended it to me finally. I did enjoy it, especially the rocks or boulders speaking to one another. But on the other side of this, somebody will recognize that, yes, they are enlightened. They're also a very regular, ordinary human being at the same time. And everything in between. They are Pope, they are garbage man, they are, teacher, they are student, they are everything and its opposite. They are evil and good and bad and light and dark and all of that combined. And the ego really fights against this. I will say that when I was at this point, one of the things that I finally had to let go of was the concept of enlightenment, because I recognized that by thinking of the self as enlightened in any way, it is inherently separating from the whole. And so letting go of that conceptualization, letting go of that need, was the key for me to move past this point in time. But if we were to go back to this concept of Zen sickness, the first definition of somebody in this place, kind of hanging out here, but not going further into ultimate reality, is that they will lose pretty much all concepts of personhood. They will be emotionally numb. They will often experience significant emotion, anxiety and depression, disassociation, depersonalization. And a lot of people consider that this is a state that they wish to remain in, even though there's, kind of still that background of anxiety and depression and awareness they can move further, because first of all, the ego screaming, not wanting to be sucked into that black hole, so to speak. But also because some people may not have an awareness that moving further into things is a possibility. We have this odd sort of thought that enlightenment is pretty similar to kind of sociopathy in the West, which is a curious thing to talk about. But if you really think about it, it's true. And the idea that any sort of moving further into things includes, again, everything at once includes and also includes bliss and ecstasy and ecstatic states, and kind of moving into a heart space of feeling love, feeling kind of all the good stuff. There is a vast difference from somebody who is not living and disassociated from their lives versus somebody who looks at awakening as being fully present, being fully involved with their lives. And so somebody moving out of this Zen sickness state will need a guide to help them know that it is okay to um, move past this state into that black hole, so to speak, into that Bindu point where everything sort of collapses into itself. And we'll also need to be aware that a state of despondency, depression, despair, um, with a thought of like not caring about anything or anyone, including the self, isn't really a state that people may want to remain in. So the second definition of Zen sickness is somebody, this is similar to the Qigong deviation, but just kind of comes about a bit differently. Somebody who has been engaged in contemplation for a long time. And what happens when we really push ourselves in terms of contemplation, what happens when we push ourselves in terms of spiritual progress for too far, for too long, is that there is a form of withdrawal that happens. And so what that means is that the person will feel really exhausted. This is kind of similar to people who are so physically exhausted that, when they go to the gym, they don't feel better after the gym. They don't feel more energy. They feel more exhausted. And not in a good, oh, my muscles got to work out way, like in a, I shouldn't have done that sort of way. So the person will generally isolate themselves, hold themselves up, will be exhausted, will generally be somebody who has been doing spiritual work, meditation, contemplation for a long period of time, often for multiple hours a day. And a lot of their symptoms really point to what in the modern day we would consider adrenal fatigue. And so there will be a lot of symptoms that emerge that have to do with a state of utter exhaustion, yet the mind keeps on going on, the mind keeps on going. Pushing oneself despite the fact of meditation no longer being fruitful or helpful, a continual feeling of overload or overwhelm. Frequently, people in this state will go to medical practitioners, energy workers, spiritual practitioners, all sorts of people, and they will find no help in those experiences for their exhaustion and for some of that energy stuff that is going on with them. There typically will be a lot of issues with sleep, insomnia, somnolence, that sort of thing. Just the feeling that the nervous system is really wired and cannot settle down, and all of the issues that can arise from that. So we can consider that somebody who is in this state has done spiritual practices essentially like they are running a marathon after running a marathon after running a marathon. So I used to see this, and still occasionally see this, in people who meditate for many hours a day, or they have gone to workshop after workshop after workshop, or sought retreat after retreat after retreat. And the result is sort of like an energetic collapse, where there is no energy in the body, where the nervous system is on fire, where all those symptoms of kind of adrenal fatigue sort of arise for the person. And yet this type of person will be the type of person Actually, quite similar to some of the extreme like athletes and people who did triathlons and Olympians and stuff like that that I've worked with, um, where they continue to do meditative practices even if they are creating sickness, more exhaustion, more difficulty for them. They are not creating solution in any way. So what does Zen sickness have to do with Kundalini awakening? In the first scenario, quite a bit. If we go to that tired old analogy of the mountain, about halfway up the mountain, if people get there, that is a Kundalini awakening. Some people start halfway up the mountain, and what happens to them is that things can be a bit more difficult, a bit more shaky, because then they have to like kind of both go up the mountain and figure out and work with the foundation and kind of the first half of the mountain at the deal with the first half of the mountain at the same time, so to speak. This is why preparatory practices are helpful. Foundational practices are so helpful. So anybody who has had energy flow above their head or even kind of past the first or second chakra in some regard is having some type of Kundalini awakening. They're aware of something beyond just me, main character, um, kind of that really tight bubble around the self where nothing else matters except for their own pain, their own awareness, their own sort of rigid mental structure. Anything going past that is awakening. When somebody starts to awaken to the point in the second or third chakra where they start to recognize that there are other people in the world, that can be considered to be kind of the start of a Kundalini awakening for a lot of people. So the person experiencing the first scenario will have had a Kundalini awakening already. The person in the second scenario may or may not, their symptoms may be a result of Kundalini awakening. Kundalini awakenings frequently result in a lot of exhaustion and people are not clear about why. And it's because we tend to look at physical labor as being significant, as being a reason to be tired, but mental, emotional, spiritual work, we don't recognize how intensive that can be, how wearing that can be on the system. And so somebody going through a Kundalini awakening, it is not rare for them to emerge with kind of the same sort of Zen sickness in the second scenario that I talked about. So there can be quite significant overlap there. Um, is it every single time somebody is experiencing Zen sickness, they're experiencing a Kundalini awakening? No, but the two often are similar enough that kind of differentiating them sometimes doesn't make sense and sometimes it does. In both cases, if somebody is at the point of exhaustion and withdrawal from life, from their body, from everything, that they need to learn how to rest and get some energy back in their system, some energy back in their life. So I hope that was helpful. I know that was kind of thorough. It's an interesting subject to talk about, but if you are experiencing any of those syndromes, any of those experiences, know that there is help and assistance out there for you. It may take finding a very experienced teacher or very experienced practitioner if they are pretty intensive. Sort of thing, or but there are people out there that can certainly help you to do so to get back into balance again.